She accepted his rejection without a plea. The entire pack went silent when the Alpha King lost control. In the town of Blackthorn Ridge, a place that outsiders never quite found on any map, there lived a young woman named Elena Voss. She was 24 years old, quiet by nature, and known throughout the pack as the daughter of the Beta. People often assumed that being the Beta's daughter meant a life of comfort and respect. In truth, it meant something closer to constant pressure. She was raised to be useful. She was raised to be dependable. She was never quite raised to believe that she mattered simply for being herself. From the time she was a child, Elena had been told one thing above all else. Her fate was tied to the Alpha King. The pack elders spoke of it as if it were carved into stone. When she turned 16 and the bond finally settled into place, connecting her to a boy 3 years older named Damien Rourke, everyone treated it like the greatest blessing a girl in her position could receive. Elena, for her part, had tried to believe it too. She told herself that fate did not make mistakes. She told herself that the ache she sometimes felt, the quiet loneliness of loving someone who barely looked at her, was simply the price of being chosen for something bigger than herself. Damien was not cruel in those early years. He was distant. He was already being trained to lead thousands of wolves, to make decisions that affected entire bloodlines, to think of the pack before he thought of anything else, including his own heart. Elena told herself she understood. She told herself that a future Alpha King could not be expected to soften for a girl who had not yet proven her worth. But proving her worth turned out to be an impossible task. No matter what she did, it was never enough. When she trained hard to strengthen her healing abilities, she was told that healers were useful but not leaders. When she tried to take part in pack council meetings, she was told that her opinions were appreciated but not needed. When she stood beside Damien in public settings, she noticed the way people's eyes moved past her, searching instead for someone more impressive, someone who looked more like a queen. The person who fit that image perfectly arrived when Elena was 21. Her name was Serafina Cole, the daughter of a powerful neighboring Alpha, sent to Blackthorn Ridge to discuss an alliance between the two packs. Serafina was confident in a way Elena had never learned to be. She spoke without hesitation in front of elders. She carried herself like someone who had never once doubted her place in a room. And more than that, she was beautiful in the effortless way that made people stop and stare, the kind of beauty that seemed built for standing beside a king. Elena watched the shift happen slowly, the way ice forms on a lake, so gradually that by the time you notice it, the whole surface is already frozen. Damien began spending more time in council with Serafina's family. He began asking her opinion on matters of pack strategy. He began smiling at things she said, small, genuine smiles that Elena could not remember him ever giving her. Still, Elena said nothing. She had spent her whole life being taught that a good mate did not complain. A good mate trusted. A good mate waited quietly for her place to be recognized. So she waited. She told herself that the bond between her and Damien was permanent, unbreakable, a fact of nature that no amount of political maneuvering could undo. She was wrong. The choosing ceremony was meant to be a celebration, a night when the Alpha King would formally present his mate to the gathered packs and confirm the succession of Blackthorn Ridge for the next generation. Elena had spent weeks preparing for it, not because she doubted the outcome, but because she wanted, for once, to feel like she deserved the moment. She wore a deep green dress that had belonged to her mother. She braided small white flowers into her hair. She stood at the edge of the great hall as the pack gathered, feeling something close to hope for the first time in years. When Damien rose to speak, the hall fell silent. Elena remembers that silence more clearly than almost anything else in her life. She remembers the way the torchlight flickered against the stone walls. She remembers the way her heart pounded, not from fear, but from a foolish, fragile kind of excitement. Then Damien spoke, and the world she had built for herself came apart in front of hundreds of witnesses. He said that Blackthorn Ridge needed a queen who could stand as an equal in matters of strategy and leadership. He said that the pack's survival depended on strong alliances, not on sentiment. He said, without once looking in her direction, that Elena Voss was not fit to carry the weight of the throne. And then he turned to Serafina Cole, took her hand in front of the entire gathering, and declared her his intended mate. There is a kind of pain that does not make a person scream. It is the kind that steals the breath first, before it ever reaches the voice. Elena felt that pain settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the eyes of the entire hall turn toward her, waiting to see how she would break. She did not break, not in front of them. She lifted her chin. She smoothed the front of her green dress with hands that trembled only slightly, and she said the only words she could manage in that moment, words that would be repeated throughout Blackthorn Ridge for years afterward. "As you wish, Alpha." Then she turned, and she walked out of the hall. Nobody stopped her. Nobody followed her. The silence that filled the great hall after her footsteps faded was heavier than any sound could have been. Even Serafina, who had won the moment, did not smile. Something about the quiet dignity of Elena's exit had unsettled everyone who witnessed it, though none of them could have said exactly why. Elena did not stay in Blackthorn Ridge long after that night. She packed only what mattered to her, said goodbye to her father, who held her tightly and said nothing because there was nothing left to say, and she left before sunrise the next morning. She traveled far from packlands, further than most wolves in her position would have dared, until she reached a small mountain town where nobody knew her name or her history. There, she built a new life, piece by piece. She used her healing skills, once dismissed as unnecessary for a future queen, to become a wildlife veterinarian. She spent her days tending to injured animals brought in by hikers and rangers, deer with broken legs, birds with damaged wings, foxes caught in traps left behind by careless travelers. There was something healing in it for her too, a quiet purpose that did not depend on anyone's approval. She rarely spoke of her past. When people asked why a woman with such skill had settled so far from any city, she gave vague answers about wanting a simpler life. She never mentioned wolves, packs, or bonds. She told herself, most days, that she had left all of it behind for good. The mountain town itself seemed to welcome her without asking questions, which was exactly what she needed. It was called Fenwick Hollow, a small collection of wooden houses and a single main street, tucked between two ridges thick with pine trees. The nearest city was hours away by car, and most of the people who lived there had come for the same reason Elena had, though none of them ever said so directly. They had come to be left alone. She rented a small cabin at the edge of town, close enough to the clinic where she worked, to walk there each morning, far enough from the center of town that she rarely had to make conversations she did not want to have. The clinic itself had been struggling to find a permanent veterinarian before she arrived, and the older man who ran it, a retired ranger named Holt, had been so relieved to have her join that he never once asked about her past. He simply handed her the keys, showed her where the supplies were kept, and let her work. The work suited her in ways she had not expected. Animals did not care about bloodlines or bonds or the politics of packs. A fox with a broken leg did not ask whether she was worthy of a throne. A hawk with a damaged wing did not care that she had once been rejected in front of hundreds of witnesses. They simply needed her steady hands and her patience, and she found, slowly, that giving those things to creatures who could not judge her helped quiet the parts of herself that still ached from being judged so publicly. She rose early each day, before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline, and walked the short distance to the clinic through air that smelled of pine and cold water. She learned the rhythms of the town, the way the general store owner always saved the last loaf of bread for her on Thursdays, the way the children who lived nearby would sometimes bring her injured birds cupped carefully in their small hands, trusting her without knowing anything about who she used to be. There was a kind of relief in being unknown, in being valued only for what she did rather than what she had once been promised to become. At night, though, the quiet of her small cabin sometimes made room for thoughts she worked hard to avoid during the day. She would lie awake, staring at the wooden ceiling, feeling the faint, persistent ache beneath her ribs that no amount of distance seemed able to fully erase. She told herself it would fade with time. She told herself that eventually she would stop waking in the middle of the night with the phantom sensation of eyes watching her walk out of a great hall she had left years behind. It did fade, in a way. The sharp edges dulled, the nights of sleeplessness became less frequent. But it never disappeared entirely, and on the rare occasions when someone passing through Fenwick Hollow mentioned news from the packs further south, Elena found herself listening more closely than she liked to admit, catching herself hoping for some scrap of information about a life she had sworn she no longer cared about. But a true bond does not simply disappear because one person walks away from it. Elena knew this in the quiet hours of the night, when the ache beneath her ribs reminded her that some part of her was still tied to a man who had rejected her in front of the world. She did not indulge that ache. She built walls around it instead, brick by brick, day by day, until she could almost convince herself it wasn't there at all. Meanwhile, back in Blackthorn Ridge, something was going wrong, though it took time for anyone to notice. Damien Rourke had believed, in the moment he rejected Elena, that he was making a sacrifice for the good of his pack. He told himself that emotions could not be allowed to interfere with matters of leadership. He told himself that Serafina Cole represented strength, stability, and a future free from uncertainty. He told himself many things in the weeks and months that followed the choosing ceremony, and for a while, he almost believed them. But breaking a true bond is not like ending an ordinary relationship. It is not a matter of simply choosing differently and moving forward. A true bond, once formed, becomes part of a wolf's very nature, woven into the same instincts that govern breathing and heartbeat. To reject it is to tear something loose from deep inside oneself, and the body does not forget that kind of wound, even when the mind insists it should. At first, the signs were small enough to ignore. Damien found himself more irritable than usual during council meetings, snapping at advisors over minor disagreements. He found it harder to sleep, waking in the middle of the night with his heart racing for no reason he could explain. His wolf, once perfectly obedient to his will, began to feel restless beneath his skin, as though it were straining against something Damien could not identify. He blamed the stress of leadership. He blamed the pressure of preparing for his upcoming mating with Serafina. He blamed anything and everything except the truth, because the truth was something he was not yet ready to face. Serafina, for her part, was not oblivious to the tension growing in her intended mate. She noticed the way his eyes sometimes went distant during conversations, as if part of him were somewhere else entirely. She noticed the way his temper, once carefully controlled, now flared without warning. She told herself, as Damien had told himself, that these were simply the pressures of leadership. She did not yet understand that she was standing beside a man whose foundation had already begun to crack. The pack elders, older and more experienced in the ways of true bonds, were the first to voice real concern. They had seen this pattern before, generations ago, in stories passed down as warnings rather than legends. An alpha who rejected a true bond and failed to find peace with that choice was at risk of something the old wolves called feral drift, a slow unraveling of the mind that occurred when the wolf's instincts and the human's will fell out of alignment. It did not happen to every wolf who broke a bond, but it happened often enough that the elders watched Damien with quiet, worried eyes as the months passed. They tried, carefully, to raise the subject with him. Damien dismissed their concerns each time, insisting that he was simply adjusting to the demands of his position. He did not want to hear that his choice might have consequences he could not undo through sheer will alone. He had built his entire identity around control, around the belief that a strong alpha could master any weakness through discipline. The idea that something as simple as a broken bond could threaten that control was to him unacceptable. There were moments, in those early months after the rejection, when Damien almost let himself admit that something was wrong. He would catch his own reflection in a window and for half a second fail to recognize the tired, hollow look in his own eyes. He would stand in the middle of a council session and lose track of what was being discussed, his mind drifting somewhere he could not name, only to snap back into focus with his advisors staring at him in confusion. He began keeping these moments to himself, afraid that admitting to them would be seen as weakness, afraid that the pack he had worked so hard to convince of his strength would begin to doubt him if they knew how unsteady he had become. Serafina noticed more than she let on. She was not a foolish woman, and she had grown up around enough powerful wolves to recognize the signs of someone unraveling, even when he insisted otherwise. She tried, in her own way to help him, suggesting he rest more, urging him to delegate some of his responsibilities to trusted advisors, even quietly consulting with healers from her own pack about remedies for stress and sleeplessness. None of it worked, because none of it addressed the actual wound, and she did not yet understand what that wound truly was. The elders understood it far better than either of them, though their understanding brought little comfort. Odessa, in particular, had watched two other alphas in her long lifetime suffer the same slow decline after rejecting bonds they had believed themselves strong enough to walk away from. In both cases, the endings had not been good ones. She kept careful watch over Damien in those years, saying little, but preparing quietly, gathering old texts about feral drift, speaking privately with healers who specialized in matters of the mind and bond alike, hoping she would never need to use what she learned, but sensing, with the weary certainty of long experience, that she probably would. A year passed, then two. Elena settled further into her quiet mountain life, and Damien's condition, though he refused to name it as such, continued its slow decline. The diplomatic alliance with Serafina's pack, meant to be sealed by their mating, kept being delayed, first for practical reasons, then for reasons that were never quite explained aloud. Privately, some of the elders suspected that Damien's growing instability was the real cause, though no one dared say it directly to his face. It was during the third year that everything came to a breaking point. A summit had been arranged between Blackthorn Ridge and several neighboring packs, an event meant to finally secure the alliance that Damien's rejection of Elena had supposedly been designed to protect. Leaders from 4 different packs gathered at Blackthorn Ridge's Great Hall, the very same hall where Elena had once walked away with her head held high. The stakes were enormous. A failure at this summit could mean years of instability for the region, old rivalries reignited, borders disputed, peace treaties abandoned. Damien had prepared for weeks. He had rehearsed his speeches. He had reviewed every detail of the negotiations. He told himself that this was the moment he would prove, once and for all, that his choices had been the right ones, that sacrificing his bond with Elena had been worth it for the strength and stability it was meant to bring his pack. But the human mind and the wolf's instinct can only be pulled apart for so long before something gives way. Midway through the summit, as tensions rose over a disputed border territory, Damien felt something shift inside him that he had never experienced before. It began as a tightening in his chest, then spread outward, a pressure building behind his eyes that no amount of willpower seemed able to hold back. His wolf, restless for years, sensed an opening and surged forward with a force that caught even Damien off guard. Those in the hall would later describe what happened next, in hushed, uncertain terms, none of them quite agreeing on the details, all of them agreeing on the fear they had felt. Damien's transformation began without his consent. His body caught halfway between man and wolf in a way that should not have been possible for someone with his level of control. His movements grew erratic. His eyes lost their familiar focus, replaced by something wild and searching. The visiting alphas, sensing danger, moved instinctively to protect their own people, and for a few terrifying moments, it seemed as though the fragile alliance Damien had sacrificed everything to build might collapse into open conflict right there in the hall. The guards who had been assigned to keep the peace during the summit found themselves suddenly facing a crisis none of their training had prepared them for. Weapons were useless against an Alpha King in this state, and using force against him risked not only his life but the fragile trust of the visiting packs, who watched with growing alarm as Blackthorn Ridge's leader thrashed within the enclosure they had hastily constructed around him. Several of the visiting alphas began murmuring among themselves, questioning openly whether an alliance with a pack whose leader could lose control so completely was wise at all. Odessa understood, watching this unfold, that far more than Damien's life was at stake in that hall. The future of Blackthorn Ridge itself hung in the balance. Serafina tried to reach him, calling his name, reminding him of who he was, but her voice seemed to pass through him without landing anywhere that mattered. The bond she shared with him, formed through political arrangement rather than fate, held no power over the instinct now driving him. The elders who understood what was happening exchanged grim, knowing looks. This was the feral drift they had feared, arriving at the worst possible moment, in front of the very leaders whose trust Blackthorn Ridge could not afford to lose. One of the oldest elders present, a woman named Odessa who had served 3 generations of alphas, made a decision in that moment that would change everything. She slipped quietly from the hall, ordered the fastest rider available, and sent an urgent message north, to a small mountain town where a woman named Elena Voss had spent 3 years trying to forget she had ever been anyone's rejected mate. The message that reached Elena that evening was simple and desperate. It did not ask her to forgive. It did not ask her to return for Damien's sake. It asked her, plainly, to save lives, because the Alpha King had lost control, and the only scent that might reach him now belonged to her. The rider who delivered the message was a young pack member Elena barely recognized, his horse lathered from the hard ride north, his voice shaking as he recounted what he had witnessed before being sent to find her. He had never expected to be trusted with something so important, and it showed in the way his hands trembled as he handed her the folded parchment, in the way he kept glancing over his shoulder as though danger might have followed him all the way to Fenwick Hollow. Elena read the message twice, standing in the dim light of her small clinic, surrounded by the quiet animals she had spent years caring for. Every instinct told her to refuse. She had built a life free from Blackthorn Ridge, free from the pain of being unwanted, free from the memory of standing in that great hall, while the man she loved chose someone else in front of everyone she knew. She owed that place nothing. She owed Damien even less. But there was another part of her, the part that had spent years healing broken wings and mending shattered bones, that could not turn away from suffering simply because it was inconvenient. She thought of the people in that hall, innocent of the choices that had led to this moment, who might pay the price for a mistake that was never theirs to make. She thought of the fragile peace between packs that had taken generations to build, now hanging by a thread because of a decision made by a man too proud to admit he had been wrong. She did not decide to go for Damien. She told herself that clearly, over and over, as she gathered her things and prepared for the long journey back to the place she had once called home. She was going because innocent lives were at risk. She was going because it was the right thing to do, not because some small, stubborn part of her heart had never fully let go of the bond she had spent 3 years trying to bury. She left instructions for Holt at the clinic, gathered a small bag of supplies including remedies she had developed over years of treating frightened, wounded creatures, and asked the young rider if his horse could manage the journey back, or if a fresh one should be found. He admitted, sheepishly, that his horse needed rest, so Elena arranged for one of the sturdier mounts kept by the town's ranger station, the same station where Holt had once worked before retiring to run the clinic. Within the hour, she was riding south, retracing a path she had once sworn she would never take again. The journey back to Blackthorn Ridge felt longer than the one that had taken her away from it. Every mile brought back memories she had worked hard to set aside, the sound of the great hall's doors, the weight of hundreds of eyes watching her walk away, the particular quality of silence that follows a public humiliation. By the time she arrived, night had fully fallen, and the packlands she once knew so well felt both familiar and strange, like a dream half remembered. Along the way, memories surfaced that Elena had not expected, small fragments of a childhood spent within these same borders, the sound of her father's voice teaching her to track injured animals through the forest, the particular smell of the training grounds after rain, the way the Great Hall's torches used to cast long shadows across the stone floor during winter council meetings. She had buried these memories so deeply during her years away that encountering them now felt like meeting old friends she had wronged by forgetting. Odessa met her at the border, her expression a careful mixture of relief and worry. She explained quickly what had happened at the summit, how Damien's control had shattered in front of the gathered alphas, how he had been contained, barely, within a reinforced section of the pack grounds usually used for training rather than crisis. She explained that no one had been able to reach him since, that his wolf seemed to have taken over entirely, leaving nothing recognizable of the man who had once commanded absolute respect throughout the region. Elena listened without interrupting, her professional instincts, honed through years of treating frightened, wounded animals, already taking over. She asked practical questions. How long had he been like this? Had anyone been harmed? What had been tried already to calm him? Odessa answered each question honestly, admitting that nothing so far had worked, that even Serafina's presence had done nothing to reach the man trapped somewhere beneath the wolf's rage. When Elena finally arrived at the training grounds, she found a scene that would stay with her for the rest of her life. A crowd had gathered at a careful distance, pack members and visiting leaders alike, watching in tense silence as Damien paced within a reinforced enclosure, his movements sharp and unpredictable, his form still caught in that painful half-transformation that should never have lasted this long. Serafina stood near the front of the crowd, her usual confidence replaced by something closer to helpless fear, her hands pressed together as if in prayer. Nobody expected Elena's arrival. A murmur rippled through the crowd as she was recognized, the rejected mate, who had walked away 3 years ago without a single word of protest, now returning at the height of the very crisis that her absence had, in some indirect way, helped create. Some faces showed surprise. Others showed something closer to shame, remembering how easily they had accepted Damien's rejection of her, how few of them had spoken up on her behalf that night. Elena did not look at any of them. She kept her eyes fixed on the enclosure, on the wild, suffering creature pacing within it, once the most powerful alpha the region had known. She felt the old ache in her chest stir back to life, sharper now than it had been in years, the bond she had tried so hard to bury reminding her, painfully, that it had never truly died. She approached the reinforced barrier slowly, ignoring the warnings called out by nervous guards. Odessa gave a small nod, granting silent permission for her to continue, trusting the old wisdom that had sent for her in the first place. Elena stopped a careful distance from the barrier and simply stood there for a long moment, watching Damien's wolf pace and snarl, searching for some flicker of recognition in eyes that seemed entirely lost to instinct. She did not plead with him. She did not remind him of what he owed her, of the humiliation she had endured, of the years she had spent rebuilding a life from the wreckage he had left behind. That was not why she had come. She had come because something inside her, stubborn and enduring despite everything, still refused to let him disappear completely into the wolf that had consumed him. "Damien," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence of the training grounds. "Come back." For a moment, nothing happened. The wolf continued its restless pacing, seemingly indifferent to the sound of her voice. The crowd held its breath, uncertain whether this desperate attempt would fare any better than the ones that had come before it. Then, slowly, the pacing slowed. The wolf's head turned toward her, nostrils flaring as though catching a scent it had not realized it was searching for. Elena stayed perfectly still, letting him find his way toward her at his own pace, resisting every instinct that told her to step back from the danger clearly still present in his eyes. "I know you can hear me," she continued, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. "I know somewhere in there, you remember who you are. You are not just this. You are more than what you let yourself become." The wolf took a hesitant step toward the barrier, then another, its movements growing less erratic with each passing second. The crowd watched in stunned silence, as the creature that had resisted every other attempt at reaching it now seemed to be calming, drawn toward the quiet, steady presence of the woman it had once cast aside. Elena felt the bond between them pulse faintly, a sensation she had not experienced in 3 long years, a thread of connection that rejection had weakened but never fully severed. She understood, in that moment, something the old stories had always tried to teach, and that pride so often refused to accept. A true bond does not disappear simply because one person decides to walk away from it. It waits, patient and enduring, for the moment when both hearts are finally ready to acknowledge what fate had already decided long before either of them had a say in the matter. "Let it go," she said softly, not entirely certain herself whether she meant the wolf's rage or her own 3 years of carefully guarded pain. "Let it go, and come back to yourself." Something in Damien finally broke, not with violence this time, but with something closer to surrender. His body, still caught in that painful half-form, began to shift and settle, the wild rigidity easing from his shoulders as awareness slowly returned to his eyes. He staggered, then sank to his knees within the enclosure, breathing hard. The fight finally drained out of him. The crowd remained silent, too stunned by what they had witnessed to speak. Odessa moved quickly to unlock the enclosure, allowing Elena to step inside, though several guards moved instinctively to stop her, uncertain if the danger had truly passed. She waved them off with a calm she did not entirely feel, and crossed the short distance to where Damien knelt, his head bowed, his breathing still ragged. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elena studied the man before her, hardly recognizable as the confident, controlled Alpha King who had once stood before the entire pack and declared her unworthy. He looked smaller now, stripped of the pride and certainty that had once defined him, reduced to something far more human than she had ever seen him. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were clear for the first time in what Odessa would later say had been nearly 3 days. There was no arrogance left in them, no trace of the man who had once believed his choices could never truly cost him anything. There was only exhaustion, and beneath it, something that looked painfully like regret. "Elena," he said, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar even to himself. "I did not think you would come. I almost didn't," she admitted honestly, seeing no reason now to soften the truth. "I told myself I owed this place nothing. I told myself I owed you even less." He absorbed this without flinching, seeming to understand that he had no right to expect otherwise. "Then why did you?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering, wanting her words to be true rather than simply comforting. "Because I spent years learning to heal broken things," she said, "and some part of me could not stand by and watch something break beyond repair, even if that something was you." The crowd outside the enclosure watched this exchange from a respectful distance, though many strained to catch fragments of the conversation. Serafina stood among them, her expression difficult to read, watching the scene unfold with the quiet understanding of someone finally seeing clearly what she had perhaps sensed all along, that the bond between Damien and Elena had never truly been broken, no matter how firmly he had once insisted otherwise. In the days that followed, Blackthorn Ridge became a place of quiet reckoning. The visiting alphas, shaken by what they had witnessed but ultimately reassured by Damien's recovery, agreed to continue negotiations, though the summit's original agenda was quietly set aside in favor of more immediate concerns. The pack elders convened privately to discuss what had happened, revisiting old stories about true bonds and feral drift with a seriousness that had been missing from their conversations in years. Serafina, to her credit, did not fight to hold on to a mating that had never truly been meant to happen. In a private conversation with Damien, one that Elena was not present for but later heard about through Odessa, Serafina admitted that she had sensed, almost from the beginning, that something essential was missing between them, a spark that no amount of political alignment or mutual respect could manufacture. She released him from their arranged mating with more grace than anyone had expected, choosing instead to return to her own pack, where she would eventually find a bond of her own, one built on choice rather than obligation. Damien, for his part, spent the following weeks in a kind of humbled reflection that those who knew him found almost unrecognizable. He sought out Elena repeatedly, not to demand her forgiveness, but simply to understand the pain he had caused, to hear from her own voice what those 3 years of rejection and exile had actually cost her. He did not try to excuse his choices. He did not blame the pressures of leadership or the expectations of his position. He simply listened, and in listening began to understand the weight of what he had so carelessly discarded on the night of the choosing ceremony. Elena, for her part, did not rush back into anything. 3 years of independence had taught her the value of her own voice, her own choices, her own worth, separate from anyone else's approval. She told Damien plainly that she would not simply return to being the quiet, dutiful mate who accepted whatever role she was given. If there was to be anything between them again, it would have to be built on equal footing, on genuine respect rather than obligation or fate alone. To his credit, Damien did not argue with this. He had learned, in the most painful way possible, exactly what happened when he tried to force his own will against the natural order of things, when he let pride convince him that control meant denying the parts of himself that made him human as well as wolf. He began, slowly and imperfectly, to include Elena's voice in matters of pack leadership, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a genuine acknowledgement of her intelligence and capability, qualities he had dismissed for years simply because they did not fit the image he had once held of what a queen should be. There were setbacks along the way, moments that tested whether either of them truly understood what needed to change. A few weeks after the summit, Damien made the mistake of assuming that Elena's return meant a return to the old arrangement, and he presented her, without asking, with a formal announcement already drafted for the pack, naming her his intended mate once again. Elena refused to sign it. She told him plainly that she would not be handed a title as though it were an apology, that if he wanted her beside him, he would need to earn that place through actions sustained over time, not through a single dramatic rescue followed by an assumption that all was forgiven. Damien, to his credit, did not argue or sulk. He withdrew the announcement without complaint and asked her instead what she needed from him. It was a small question, but it was one he had never thought to ask her in all the years before, and the asking of it mattered more than he seemed to realize. Elena told him she needed time. She needed to see, through ordinary days rather than extraordinary crises, whether the man who had knelt before her in that enclosure was someone who could sustain change once the immediate danger had passed. So he tried. He began attending the small clinic Elena set up on the edge of Packlands, not to oversee her work, but simply to understand it, sitting quietly in the corner while she treated injured animals brought in by pack members and neighboring farmers alike. He asked questions about her methods, listened to her explanations without impatience, and slowly began to see the same quiet competence in her healing work that she had once tried and failed to bring to his council meetings. He started inviting her opinion on pack matters, not as a formality, but because he had genuinely come to value how she thought, how she noticed details others missed, how she considered the long-term well-being of pack members rather than only the immediate political advantage. There were harder conversations too, ones that neither of them enjoyed, but both understood were necessary. Elena told him, in careful and measured words, exactly what it had felt like to stand in that great hall and hear him declare her unworthy in front of everyone she had ever known. She told him about the nights in Fenwick Hollow, when the ache of the broken bond had kept her from sleeping, about the years she had spent convincing herself she felt nothing at all, because feeling something had simply hurt too much. Damien listened to all of it, without defending himself, without offering excuses about pressure, or duty, or the expectations placed on an alpha king. He simply listened, and at the end, he apologized in a way that did not ask for anything in return, not forgiveness, not a renewed bond, nothing except her willingness to have been heard. Slowly, month by month, the pack around them began to notice the shift as well. Council meetings that had once run, according to Damien's word alone, began to include Elena's perspective as a matter of course, not because anyone demanded it, but because her insights so often proved useful that ignoring them would have been foolish. Younger wolves in the pack, watching this change unfold, began to understand leadership differently than they had before, no longer as a matter of unquestioned command, but as a partnership between people willing to listen to one another, even when it was uncomfortable to do so. Months passed. The bond between them, weakened by years of rejection but never fully broken, began to heal in its own time, not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through small, consistent acts of honesty and respect. Elena eventually agreed to stay in Blackthorn Ridge, though she insisted on continuing her work as a healer, tending not only to pack members, but to the same kinds of wounded animals she had cared for during her years away. Damien supported this without hesitation, finally understanding that her strength had never needed to look like his own to be valuable. The pack, watching this slow transformation unfold, began to speak of Elena differently than they once had. No longer was she remembered only as the mate who had been rejected in front of everyone, the quiet girl who walked away without a single word of protest. She became known instead as the woman whose calm strength had saved their Alpha King from a fate that had claimed others before him, the healer whose steady presence had done what no amount of force or authority could accomplish. Elena's father, who had held her tightly and said nothing the morning she left, was among the first to embrace her when she finally chose to stay in Blackthorn Ridge for good. He told her, with tears he made no effort to hide, that he had spent 3 years regretting his own silence on the night of the choosing ceremony, wishing he had found the courage to speak up for his daughter when the entire hall had watched her walk away alone. Elena forgave him easily, understanding better than most how difficult it could be to find the right words in a moment that demanded courage. She told him that his love in the years since, expressed through countless letters she had kept carefully folded in a drawer in her cabin, had said more than any single moment of bravery could have. Odessa, watching from the sidelines with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen many seasons come and go, often remarked to the younger pack members that true strength rarely announced itself loudly. It showed itself, she said, in the ability to remain steady when the world demanded otherwise, in the willingness to walk away with dignity rather than beg for scraps of respect, and in the courage to return, not out of weakness, but out of a compassion strong enough to withstand even the deepest wounds. As for Damien, the experience left a permanent mark on him, one that no amount of time could fully erase. He remained a capable and respected Alpha King, but the arrogance that had once defined his leadership softened into something closer to wisdom. He no longer believed that control meant suppressing every vulnerability. He understood now that true strength included the humility to admit mistakes, the willingness to change, and the recognition that even an Alpha King was not above the natural order that bound true mates together, whether he chose to acknowledge it or not. Years later, when younger wolves in Blackthorn Ridge asked about the night the Alpha King had lost control, the story they heard was not one of shame, but of quiet redemption. They heard about a woman who had accepted rejection without begging for what she was owed, who had walked away with her dignity intact, and who had returned, not for revenge or vindication, but because compassion, in the end, proved stronger than pride. They heard about an alpha who had learned, in the hardest way possible, that some bonds cannot simply be discarded without consequence, no matter how much power or position a person holds. And though the pack had once fallen silent, watching Elena walk away in the aftermath of her rejection, it fell silent again years later for an entirely different reason. Watching her stand beside Damien at a new ceremony, this one held not out of political necessity or forced obligation, but out of a bond finally allowed to exist on its own terms, chosen freely by two people who had both learned, through pain and patience, exactly what it meant to truly deserve each other. The green dress Elena wore that day was not the same one from years before, though it carried the same quiet grace she had shown on the night everything had fallen apart. As she stood before the gathered pack, no longer waiting for approval she had once believed she needed, she understood something she wished she could have told her younger self on that painful night in the Great Hall. Rejection, however cruel, does not have to be the end of a person's story. Sometimes it is simply the beginning of learning exactly how much strength a quiet dignity can hold, and how far that strength can carry a person, even back to the place where their heart was once broken, transformed now into something whole.